So the interview is now live. You are now face-to-face or over a video conferencing service, and you're actually having a conversation, and the interview has begun. Let's walk through the tips and recommendations that I have so that you can execute on the interview, smoke it, and stand out as a candidate. So this is the important part. You're there, you've made it, this is what all the preparation that we talked about was for. So now when you're in the interview, a few things that you want to do. You want to focus on having a conversation, and you want to focus on the communication that you're actually engaging with. One of my goals when I actually go into interview is actually to be the person that's leading the conversation. So I want to take control of that conversation, not in an aggressive manner, but actually open up by starting, I like to connect on a little bit more personal level, and this is just a personality trait of mine, but if this is something you want to deploy in your interviews, I highly recommend it. And this is where looking up somebody on LinkedIn ahead of time can give you a really big leg up. So having a little bit of small talk, asking them about, their family, asking them about how long they've been here, really just starting to get to know them. And what it does is it actually sets the interviewer at ease. And here's a really big myth, is people think that the interviewer is always more comfortable than the interviewee. A lot of times that's not the case. The interviewer a lot of times is just as nervous to interview you as you are to go into that interview. So if you can take control of that conversation, it's not only going to set you at ease, but it's also going to set the interviewer at ease, and it's really going to create a good stream and a good flow of dialogue that a lot of people sit back and just wait to be asked questions. One of the biggest myths of interviews is that it's all about just getting asked questions. They're really assessing your ability to communicate. They're really assessing your ability to have a conversation. And so by taking control of that conversation, you're really showing that to them versus telling them that you can do that when they ask you that type of question. So that's the first recommendation, is try and take control of that conversation and just start it out to really break the ice so that you can really remove some of that tension if you do have a little extra stress around the interview itself. When you're actually interviewing and they're asking you questions, make sure you answer their question directly. If they ask you what your weakness is, don't go off and talk about your strength. If they actually ask you what your strength is, don't go off and talk about your weakness. Make sure that you give them the answer, and then make sure that you give them the space to ask follow-up questions. So I'll give you an example here. When I go into an interview, a lot of times in an interview, one of the first conversations or one of the first questions that gets asked is, tell me a little bit about yourself. So I work as a Scrum Master in the IT field, and that's a form of project management. And I'll tell them a little bit about my background. I'll tell them that some of the industries that I've worked in. I'll tell them how long I've been doing it. I'll tell them some of my strengths. But what I'm going to preface that conversation with is I'm going to say something to the extent of, I'm going to give you a very high-level overview. I'll give you the 1,000-foot view. Let me know if there's any specifics that you want me to drill in on. So then what that gives them the space to do is it gives them the space to ask me follow-up questions, and now I don't have to back myself in the corner and give a 10-minute long answer. I can share what I do in a minute and a half, and I can then ask them, is there any specifics that you want me to drill in on, or did you want to move on to other questions? That really allows me to take control of the interview. It will allow you to take control of the interview. And then what it does is it shows really good communication skills. One thing you don't want to do in an interview is sometimes when people get nervous, they tend to ramble. So they'll say, tell me about yourself, and you ramble on for 10 minutes, you've lost the interviewer by that point. You want to say, I'll give you the 1,000-foot view, I'll give you the 10,000-foot view, and then if there's items that you want me to drill in on, I'm more than happy to do so. And so I'm always starting very high and then drilling in as they ask me. So I'm not starting by drilling in and coming back out high. So focus on doing that. What that'll do is it'll just communicate things in a lot better manner, because you might use very industry-specific verbiage from a previous position that your interviewer just might not understand. And now you go off on a 5-minute tangent and they've lost you when you used a word 5 minutes ago. So just be very conscious of that when you're actually sitting in the interview. So as the dialogue goes on, as the conversation goes on, you're leading the conversation. You're going back and forth. You're answering the questions that they're asking you. They might, have your resume in front of them. You've provided them a copy if they needed one. Now you get to a point in the interview where they ask you, do you have any questions for us? And at this point in the interview, this is where those pre-written out 10 to 12 questions become very valuable. And as you have those questions, now you can page through your notebook that you've been taking notes in throughout the interview, which I highly recommend doing, is have a notebook with you and just make sure that when they say something that you're just jotting some things down so that it looks like you're very engaged in the interview. Most people show up to an interview with absolutely nothing. You do not want to do that. You want to show up with a notebook with your questions and a notebook to take notes in throughout the interview. So you don't need to be sitting there writing the minutes or being a scribe for the conversation, but just take some notes down on things that they say. Make comments so that you can come back and ask a question off of something that you guys had a conversation on earlier in the interview. So when you're at the question phase, you can now page through your 9-10 questions, and you can actually talk through. I typically recommend asking about 3 to 5 good questions. I recommend always having more questions prepared than you are planning to ask for several reasons. Number one, I recommend asking a question based off of what somebody said throughout the interview. So that's clearly something that you can't prep for because that's based off the conversation specifically that you had. So one of your questions is actually going to be, at least one of your questions will arise from the interview itself. Second reason is a lot of your questions actually might get answered throughout the interview by them just saying certain things. So if you have a bunch of questions written out or only 2 questions written out and both of them are answered, now you're scrambling and you feel a little frantic. So by having 9, 10, 11, 12 good questions written out, you can now page through and ask your top 3 or 4. And by giving extra space, you can now write out answers. I recommend writing out a little more diligently when you ask the question and they're giving you the answer, just because it's something you specifically are asking of them. So be sure to take good notes when they are answering your question. And that will go a really long way just in them looking and seeing that you're very diligent and very in tune with the interview. And then the other mindset behind that is by not asking all of your questions, it actually looks like you're very over-prepared. So once again, it keeps you in the driver's seat, and you can page through and you can say, actually I don't think I need to ask that question. I don't need to ask that question. And it creates a sense that you're very well prepared as you've walked into the interview. So just make sure that those questions are written out ahead of time. Make sure that you're taking good notes throughout the interview and really focus on taking control of the interview itself. Because like I said, the interviewer is probably just as nervous as you are when you're actually entering into that interview. So once the interview begins to wrap up, this is a very key portion of the interview. So I recommend writing in very bold letters at the top of your notebook, get emails. And so I recommend doing 2 things that afterwards that you want to make sure if you really want to get that position. We're going to recommend that folks either do one of 2 things, that you either write an email to the individuals that you had a chance to interview with, or you can actually write a letter to them, or you can type something up and bring it to HR and say, could you put this on the desk of these folks that I interviewed with, so that you can really go above and beyond and show that you really want the position and that you're doing that extra little touch. So I see a lot of people get caught up in the interview. They're so, they get into the interview and they're asking questions, and then they can potentially forget to ask for emails. And then getting them after you leave is very, very tricky and very tough because you're working through HR who doesn't really know who you're working with, or you're working through a recruiter who may know one of the contacts. So just ask them. If you're on Zoom or you're on a video conferencing platform, you can just say, hey, in the chat box, would you mind just sharing your email so I can just send you a follow-up email really thanking you for your time. So now they're expecting it. You can just tell them that's what you're going to do. When you're sitting in an in-person interview, you can just ask them for their email, and then just make sure that when you write it down, you can read it, so that when you go home, it's actually legible, and you know what you wrote down, and you can read your chicken scratch. So having those emails and having those names is going to play a very vital role in what we are going to recommend doing after the interview to create the last touch point that's going to set you apart as a candidate. And if you continue to execute on these tips, once again, it's going to put you in that stress-free state of mind so that you know all of the ancillary details are taken care of as you've entered into an interview, and you have the ability to focus on the highest priority items, which is controlling the conversation, which is showing off your skill set, and which is dazzling with the preparation that you did on the questions that they're going to ask.